It's on. Okay, good. Great. Welcome. My name is Mike Denham, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our February program of this year's Florida Lecture Series, produced by the Lawton Child Center for Florida History. Before we welcome tonight's special guests, I'd like to say a thank you to all of you that have donated to our efforts this year. And I really appreciate you coming out tonight. And I'm delighted to see that everybody is maintaining the mask mandates and so forth. If you have a need for one, we've got plenty of them out there. I also want to recognize J.B. Bauer, who is our bookstore manager here at Florida Southern. He's done an excellent job getting our books available for our writers, and we've got a number of really good ones tonight. I'm sorry to say, or sad to say, that this evening is our last evening in this fine auditorium this year. We have, of course, our last program. It will be in Hollis, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But I want to thank Crystal Norman and her Branscomb staff, some of whom are back here. But also, Crystal is, of course, coming around. She does a great job. She's a great professional. And she has arranged, many of you know already, she's arranged for our programs to be live streamed, but also they're available on the YouTube, the Florida Southern College YouTube channel, and you can get those by visiting our website. Next month, on March 17th, we will welcome 2 scholars of the Mariel Boatlift experience, and that will be in Hollis Room, which is where we used to have a lot of our programs. Florida Southern College professor Jose Garcia and Professor Victor Pryor from Connecticut will be down visiting. Both of them are experts and participants. Actually, Dr. Garcia is a participant of the Mariel Boatlift, which is one of the most dramatic human dramas really in my lifetime as a Floridian. They both examined this issue in written form, and of course this is our last regularly scheduled event of our series. But as we often do, we have an exciting add-on program that we have a week after Dr. Garcia and Dr. Pryor are with us, and that involves a presentation by former FSC baseball player and former major leaguer Greg Pryor. Greg Pryor was a key member of the 1971 and 1972 national championship teams, and then he went on to play in 10 years in the major leagues. And he played for the Texas Rangers, the Chicago White Sox, and was also a member of the Kansas City Royals 1985 World Championship team, which included, of course, George Brett and many other stars. He played with with George Brett, Bo Jackson, Gaylord Perry, Reggie Jackson, and Carlton Fisk, and others. And he's the author, actually, of a book. He lives in Kansas City, but he is the author of a great book. I love the title, The Day the Yankees Made Me Shave. Many of you know, if you're baseball fans, that the Yankees are very fastidious about facial hair for their ball players. Anyway, that's one of 27 memorable stories that he has in the book that he'll be with us to sign, and that'll be in Annie Pfeiffer Chapel, and that will be on March 24th. We have some flyers outside, and you might want to get one. Now I'm delighted to be able to welcome tonight's special guest, acclaimed writer Janis Owens. This is a special treat for me because I have admired Janice for a long time, and finally now I'm able to have a chance to share her with you. Many of you may know or remember that she was here quite some time ago when Rob Tate, is Rob Tate in the audience tonight? Rob Tate had a wonderful English literature program where he would invite authors. Anyway, she's the author of 5 award-winning novels and a memoir, cookbook, which are available, of course, outside. and she's also written a recent book of nonfiction, which she's going to share with us tonight. She has a love. She has a love for cracker culture because, like myself, she is one. Born in Marianna in 1960, the last child and only daughter of an Assembly of God preacher who later became an insurance salesman, Janice attended the University of Florida, where she was a student of Harry Cruz's creative writing workshop at Gainesville. Pat Conroy kind of discovered Janice, the famous South Carolina writer. Pat Conroy called her one of the finest novelists of our time. She is the author of acclaimed novels, including My Brother Michael, Myra Sims, The Schooling of Claybird Catts, and my favorite, American Ghost, which many of you know that I don't read much fiction, but I can tell you this is a great one. Her essays on Florida life have appeared in New York Times, Washington Post, Writer's Digest, and many other publications. Also, she's the author, once again, of a wonderful memoir cookbook, Cracker Kitchen, which is available outside. I was reading it last night, and I found it just one of the most delightful things I've ever read in a long time. Ms. Owens' most recent project is the work of a creative nonfiction. It's called Hidden in Plain Sight. It's a twisted tale of death and mayhem in her adopted home of Newberry, Florida. Janice Owens is a Florida original, but her literary scope and her commentary reaches well beyond the Sunshine State. Her books and her words speak about a South that's still with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Janice Owens to Florida Southern College. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm always fascinated to hear the introduction because I'm like, who are they? What is that? And who is that? And that's me. And I want to start. I'm doing a slideshow, which I am new to. So if I get lost and have to bring my husband up here to refine the slide, y'all just bear with me. My father graduated from Florida Southern. In 1958, Lawton Childs was a professor of his, and we were big Lawton Childs fans, even when I didn't know any other politician except Lawton Childs. So it's an honor to be here tonight. I'm a novelist. That is a novelist, and the reason I'm a novelist is because I was raised in a storytelling family. If any of you are from the South, you know those storytelling families where storytelling was our religion. I mean, we told stories in church. We told, around the funerals, everywhere we told stories, and I grew up on them. So when I got old enough to go to the library and get free books, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to tell stories. So I love the South. My family's been in the South. I'm an amateur genealogist, and I've been doing genealogy so long, I've rarely got us out of the Carolinas because we've been here since the 1600s, and moved down to Alabama and then Georgia. I won't bore y'all. I got to move on tonight. But so we came from this. Before I tell the story I'm going to tell, I'm going to tell you that I don't tell the story. I've come out of a background where the story, my family is very similar to the Dudleys, who I'm about to speak of. And our family in South Alabama, Southern family, I'm going to show the first, that's my big mama, Omi Jackson. That's her younger brother, E.G., and Leonard right here, Uncle Lynn and Uncle John. You can see that they're part Indian, and they called themselves Little Black Dutch. And we were growing up in Alabama and in West Florida. It was just a weird term. Nobody knew what it meant. And they were, I must say, I write about this whole phenomena of racial isolates in American Ghosts because I was trying to figure out my family, because with exceptions, my mother being an exception, her father being an exception, they were very racist, very racist. That's how the whole subject that I've come into. I'm not coming in from the outside pointing a finger. I'm trying to work out my own history because I love the South. I also grew up in the church South. I grew up in the butterbean South. I wrote a whole cookbook about cornbread. I went on the road 2 years and talked about cornbread. I did the whole everything, so I love the South, but I know that it's this was Big Mama. This isn't about the it's around 1915. This is my granny in Polk County. That's her catching a perch. This is my role model, my granny I love. Not a racist, by the way. She was this, the Southern granny you dream about. I write about her quite a bit in Cracker Kitchen. That was the reason I wrote the book, is in honor of her. So that's Granny. And that is my mother and father. Daddy came here. He was actually here because he got called to the ministry. We were Assemblies of God, and he went to Southeastern, which it was called at the time. And he met a former preacher's wife, my mother, Martha. And that's them at the wedding. And you see the happy, if you're from a small town in America, you see the joy in this picture. This is the South. This was taken in Marianna. And this is the monument, one of many monuments that I have relatives who fought for the Confederacy. This one is in Livingston, Alabama. And the Roberts, who's carved on it, is my great-great-grandfather. And great-great-grandfather. He was in the South. My grandfather was born in 1885, and my grandmother, the one who was holding the fish, it was the man who's on the monument was her grandfather, and she grew up around him. So we actually heard the Civil War stories, and how they were so afraid before battles, and I since then have done follow-up because he actually fought all the way through the war. So this is my background here, and there we are, more evidence that we are Florida crackers. That's me and my brothers and my Farrah Fawcett hairdo. That was in Ocala in 1978. So having grown up in that and loving to read, I truly stumbled into Harry Cruz's creative writing program at UF. A friend of my husband's. The reason I went to UF is I was on a Pell needs-based grant, and it was cheap and easy to get into back then, if you can believe it. That was the way UF was then. And I stumbled into Harry Cruz, and when he read my first story, he said, a lot of English majors were going to go on to be lawyers, and he said, are you going to be lawyers that way? And I said, no, I want to be a writer. And he said, you are a writer. And that's all it took. One man, he told me, Harry Cruz told me I was a writer, and that was it. I was a writer. So from then on, I wrote. I was also married by that time to my husband. I got married when I was 19, and we had 3 children, so he was a teacher. And when I graduated from UF, I moved to a little town called Newberry. And it was really similar to me because it was similar to Marianna. It was a small town. It's just 11 miles west of Gainesville. And we lived in a little house in downtown Newberry. And all of my neighbors were these I loved them. They were like my granny. They were these farmers' wives who had moved into town, let their sons take over the farm. And I loved them. They loved me. We were a match made in heaven. So, but I knew that Newberry had a past, and the reason I knew Newberry had a past was when I was at the University of Florida. I had Harry Cruz. I also had Richard Scher, who I was taking a Southern politics class, and he asked me to do an individual study. And so I was casting around for something that no one had done, and I said, there was they hung a black guy in Marianna, and my uncle and he looked at me and said, yeah, that's the Claude Neal lynching. And I said, is it? And he said, well, if you could write a paper on that, that'd be great. So I said, yeah, I can. Yeah, sure. And so I started calling my relatives, and at first, they would tell me what they knew. My aunt was 14 when it happened outside Marianna, but they'd all lived through the riot afterwards. And then my mother found out I was writing a paper, and that shut down. Nobody would talk to me. Nobody would talk to me about anything. I mean, it was shut down. So I ended up writing a paper on larger family history, but it planted a seed in my brain. I studied it enough. I'm not going to talk on the Neil lynching. I'm about to show you a picture, but it is so intricate in itself. But it was like human sacrifice. It was the most horrible thing I'd ever heard of happening to anyone. So I started thinking, how could this be? That this is the same family, that we love each other, and I just couldn't reconcile the Butterbean South to the Claude Neal, the racist South. And the photograph I'm about to show is widely shown. This was after Claude Neal was killed out in Greenwood. They drug his body in town and hung it on the courthouse square, where one uncle of mine didn't mean to see it. He was the paper boy, and he was delivering the Jacksonville newspaper and rode by and saw it, and he never spoke about it again in his life. Another uncle was a 15-year-old who was from out there, and he was part of the festivities where they cut off his fingers afterwards, and there was a whole study. But at that time, now the Claude Neal lynching has been researched more. I've been part of the research, but at this time, nobody knew, nobody would talk. So that was a seed in my mind. So when I moved to, I'm going to move along because I hate seeing that picture. Well, I got to move back because, wait a minute. So when I was, let me move back. This picture is just, we're going to watch me for a second, my brothers. But anyway, when I was in Newberry, I was aware that there was a lynching there, but I'd never lived in a town that didn't have a lynching. You know, we'd all heard the stories, and you know, when you're a cracker in Florida, it was expected, and we had gone through the civil rights. My father had a church. My father was still a preacher and moved around. We lived in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and we were not on the side of the civil rights marchers. You know, we were afraid, actually. We were afraid of all these changes. And so when I moved to Newberry, I knew there'd been a lynching, but I was on the historic board. I joined the ladies, and I had a historic board, but I didn't they didn't mention it very often, and I didn't, maybe once. One lady and I, but they were all up in their 80s, and you could tell it was just this buried history. But I moved on, and since I was a storyteller and writing books, I wrote books. I wrote 3 books. My brother Michael and Myra Sims and the Schooling of Claybird Catts. The first 2 were published with Pineapple, and the third with HarperCollins. So I was a professional writer, like I always wanted to be, and I went and spoke, and I told all these family stories. I mean, that's kind of what I did. That's what I did for a living. And I was outside of Newberry. I wasn't that much into Newberry, and I was trying to write a book on my family's racial history, but it was so stinking confusing between the violence and the Little Black Dutch, and I found out the origin of the word, that I couldn't get a book out. So a friend of mine, Dana St. Clair, a lot of times when I'd go outside the South and talk about being a Southern novelist, I would correct whoever introduced me, and I'd say, well, really, I'm a Florida cracker. And when I say Florida cracker, people would about faint. They would say, like, what did you call yourself? So it started being part of my thing, is to explain what I meant when I said Florida cracker. So I was invited to speak at a cracker symposium, truly, at Amelia Island. And the next morning, Dana St. Clair said, you need to write a cookbook, because that's all crackers do is eat and procreate. So I said, I can do that. So I wrote The Cracker Kitchen, and the first story I wrote in it was about my grandmother and mother, because they grew up in a time when they were such smart women, but in our religion and in our culture, you know, cooking and doing the house and cooking the most incredible food, that was their artistic outlet. That was the way they loved their family. That's what they were famous for. So that's the love I put into that book. And it was reviewed. I sold it to my agent. I didn't think anybody'd buy it. I thought I would self-publish it. And my agent sold it to Simon & Schuster, to Scribner, actually. And then it was reviewed all over the world. They'd call it American colonial cooking. They didn't call it cracker cooking. But they would, in everything, they'd say I was a self-proclaimed Florida cracker, and they didn't want to touch that, but that's what I went around talking for 2 years. So when I came home after doing all the speaking, and I loved it. I had so much fun. I mean, it was just coming and speaking to the family. And in my book, I address all kinds of things. So when I came home, I was decided to finish. I was able to finish the book I was writing at the time about the racial stuff. And at that point, I didn't know anybody was studying lynchings. I just thought they were in the past, and nobody talked in Newberry, nobody talked in Marianna. So I fictionalized everything in this book. And at the end of it, I called it American Ghost. And I didn't have a title until the very end. And a Gestalt therapist my daughter introduced me to in Austin was sitting around talking, and he said about living here with all these American ghosts. And I said, that's my title, American Ghost, that's my title. So I wrote American Ghost. And in the time, if you sell a book, that Scribner bought it too, in the time you sell a book, you have this like a year and a half. Now it's really long, but then it was a year and a half wait where you just sit around, think about things. So I was at home in Newberry. This would have been in about 2011. And my oldest daughter sent me an email from work, and she said, Mama, do you know that there's a lynching photograph from Newberry? I saw it on a video, and I was like, no, never happened. Nope, didn't happen. And she said, yeah, it is. So I found it on a part of a video, and after tracking down, I found a man named Dr. Marvin Dunn, and I didn't know where he lived. I thought he lived locally. And I asked him, I said, do you have that picture? Because I'd like to see it, because I did a lot of historic stuff. I knew a lot of people in Newberry. So he said, yes, I'll bring it by tomorrow. I didn't realize that he lived in Coral Gables, and he got in his car. He had found this photograph in the Jacksonville Library, bowels of it, like decades ago, and it wasn't ID'd, and he had a copy of it. So he drove all the way up to Newberry, came to my house, and he had this enlarged photograph he pulled out on my coffee table, and this was the photograph. And if you see, these are the bodies, and these are the men standing around it. And as soon as I saw this, I don't keep anything a secret. Historians and everyone, anything I know, everybody knows. It's on the public record. I don't say a lot of names in public because it's really traumatic for everybody if they find out something with me standing on a podium. So, but I'm not keep it a secret. I'm transparent about it. But this gentleman right here, I knew. He was part of our historic committee. And when I saw it, you could tell, Marvin Dunn could tell, he does research and goes and researches these. He's a black man who grew up in DeLand. His family were orange pickers. And in his retirement, he was a psychology professor. And when he retired, he went around to places on the ground to try to break the silence of these things. So he had come up and showed me the photograph. And when I recognized number 22 here, I was so shocked, and I was really, because I was thinking, I told him I had to go to the bathroom, and when I went in there, I was thinking, there are just so many other issues, that dragging up this, and this, is there any point, but the thing that really, I prayed about it, and it's the golden rule, and I wasn't sure who he wasn't sure who I was. He knew I'd written a book called The Cracker Kitchen, and I lived out in the middle of nowhere. But I came out and told him, I said, yes, I know some of the faces. I knew when I was on the historic committee, these gentlemen right here, there's a state farm called the Dudley State Farm. It's just been put on the National Registry. And when I was in the early days of when Myrtle Dudley was still alive, I had a little bit. I wasn't one of the, people that made it happen, but I was a volunteer. And I had read the book, seen all the pictures, and I knew, I knew those were the Dudley brothers. They've been identified, so I don't mind saying that those are right there. So I told him, yeah, I can tell you who. And so we live 4 minutes from Dudley Farm, so I didn't know what he was going to do with it. It was just this weird moment in my life. And he went, and the Rangers identified them, and so the picture was identified. Now it's had a lot of research. But the fact that it was such a secret to me, and I had lived there, and I loved my community, and I had heard many secrets, that it made me start researching the Dudley family. I knew nothing. I didn't know that it had been researched. Now I know that there was ongoing research. I didn't know it at the time. So I just started not going to libraries or just sitting at my computer. My husband's job, we moved out of the state for a few years, and sitting on my computer, we kept our house in Newberry, and sitting at my computer, I started putting the pieces of the puzzle together from the census and from the things that my elderly friends, who had all passed by now, had told me. And it became this, it just bites you when you get the history, but when you're following, I'm compelled by curiosity. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I found out. This is the second. He had 2 lynching photographs. I should have warned you, these are graphic. So we believe these were taken at the same time, and I will return to explain a little bit later. So the part of Florida we're talking about here, since I assume everyone knows, this is an early map of Florida, and this is Alachua County right here. And East Florida here was not well settled in 1850. And a gentleman named, if you go to Dudley Farm, you'll hear all this because it's in the biography and it's in the collections. This is the gentleman, Captain Philip Harvey Dudley, and this is his wife. Well, at that point, Dudley had become, it was like a Disney version of, you hardly saw a single thing about any of the black laborers. But the fact of the matter is that the captain started out as a slave trader, and that's how he really made his fortune. And he lived at Dudley. He died in 1880, and this is the Dudley farmhouse that's there right now. And this is Ben Dudley. These are the daughters. They had a whole slew of children. It's Fanny Dudley. These are their, some of them are their sons. This was taken in about around the turn of the century, around 1900. So this is the family, and since the state park they were doing this huge effort. I'm part of that effort now of the collections of the Dudley memorabilia, but it had been so whitewashed that I didn't think they knew. I didn't think they knew about the lynching because it was so secret and that I just didn't think they knew. This is around 1916, that's the store. That's the Dudley store, and the Gainesville Road went right across here, and that's the Dudley house. So the reason Newberry came on the map was something y'all do know about in Lakeland, phosphate. Except the phosphate up here where we're at was hard rock phosphate. It wasn't pebble, you had to hack it out. And it was such a hard job that convict leasing became, the mine started just before the turn of the century. And then Newberry was founded right about then, and then Newberry became a boom town. The mines were owned by Europeans, Germans, and they owned it, and they bought it for fertilizer. So the phosphate belt made, wait a minute, I'm doing the wrong thing. The phosphate belt, and when the phosphate came, so did the old railroad. And there we go, there's Newberry, finally on the map. And it went right down here. That's where it went from Jacksonville down. And so Newberry was created around it. And I'll tell you I call this stumbling on story. Jim Haskins, my professor at UF, used to say, writers don't make up stories, you stumble on them. And this is the railroad Newberry we're talking about. This is still largely intact, the old Newberry. Our house was right about there when I lived there. And I know the names of the people who built everything. This was when it had just been cut over for lumber in about 1910. or 1913 as it turned out. So Newberry had a boom town. It had saloons. It was like your old west towns. It had open saloons. It had kniving, shootings. It was a tough place. I could write a book on murders in Newberry because I've found so many of them. And this is the Swanee Pharmacy. This is Dr. Getson, whose family I do know. And this is Dr. Ruff, and this young man is Lem Harris. He's about to enter the story. And that he was a pharmacist, doctor in Newberry. And I knew their families. Here's the Newberry when the railroad came in. There's the Newberry Railroad. And this is one of the Franklin. There were 14 mines around Newberry at the peak. And the Phosphate, Dutton, Coomer, there were Mutual. There were all large and small. And so right about during the mining time, it was such a rough and tumble place. This was the sheriff of Alachua County, Sheriff Ramsey, who I have respect for. I mean, you come into histories like this with mixed feelings, and when you see him, he's in the mob shot I just showed you, but he actually kept Newberry from being burnt down from further violence happening. But both he and his son, and I believe his grandson, were all sheriffs, and he was an effective sheriff. And in Newberry, this was the constable, George Wynne. It's the only it's not the only photograph. I'll dig up another one eventually. But he had a reputation, as lawmen did then. He was tough. I mean, I have recorded all of his arrests that I found in the Gainesville Sun and shootings, and he was efficient. That's when he was shot. That was what he was remembered for, being very efficient. As it turned out, George Wynne was a bachelor, and Fanny Dudley, the matriarch of the Dudley family, who was in the earlier photograph, he was her younger brother that she had raised. So they were great ties. He lived at Dudley. He had a property. If you go to the Dudley State Farm right now, his house was directly behind the Dudley farmhouse. And let me tell you. So here's his grave, which is in Quitman, Georgia. And you see the dates. He was killed on August 18th, 1916. And what happened, we have many versions, so I'm going to condense this into, even the court records, they're just different versions. He came from Gainesville with a man who was driving him named Grady Blunt, and Lem Harris, the young pharmacist I showed you before, and they stopped to arrest a man who was not a stranger to him. He was a black man who had grown up on the Jones farm right across from Dudley, who were cousins of theirs. So they had grown up together. They had the same granny midwife, and I'll get to that in a second too. But they knew each other, and he went to arrest him. According to the trial and everything afterwards, people said that he went in and told he went to a man's house but the man house he went to, his name is Bosie Long, and he told him to strike a light and light. It's a real tiny little tenant house. No, it was his own. He owned it actually, but told him to get dressed, and he was going to take him into Newberry on hog stealing charges, which right now we think of hog stealing as being different. Hogs were still mostly feral in Newberry. The Dudleys had 100 hogs running around, and there was always huge disputes. If you know hunting feral hogs, you know that it's a whole thing. But just lately in Newberry, when World War I started, the mines started closing. And so all of a sudden, there were bankruptcies and stores were closing, but the Swift plant in Jacksonville had opened up, and you could haul your hogs by train. So hogs as a cash crop began to be suddenly popular. So, and new breeds and better breeds, and it wasn't just wild hogs. So being accused of stealing a hog was a very big deal. So he was accused of stealing a hog. According to his own testimony, he was getting dressed, and he had which was illegal at the time, he would have been arrested for it, a firearm, a pistol, and he said when George Wynne saw the pistol, he shot him. Both the men were pointing the gun at him while he got dressed. According to George Wynne testimony, he died shortly, but the testimony against him was that Bosie Long just pulled a gun and shot him when he tried to arrest him. I wasn't in the house. What we do know is that Grady Blunt, the man waiting in the car, heard 6 shots in rapid succession, and he ran into the house, and Bosie Long had run away, and George Wynne was shot. You know, when you got shot in the abdomen back then, yeah, he knew. He said, "I'm killed. I'm dead." Help Lynn Harris had gotten shot in his gun hand. So they packed up, Grady packed them up in his car, took them into Newberry, called the sheriff, and there was this huge uproar. They tried, Deputy Wynne wanted to go home. He wanted to be taken to his sister, Fanny Dudley, at Dudley and die there, because that was the only home he ever knew. But they say that the state man, whoever, maybe the sheriff, wanted them to try. So they put him on a train to Jacksonville. I know for a fact one of my neighbors, who was a dear friend of mine, Miss Katie B. Cook, she was 50 years older than me, her uncle was the man who drove him to Jacksonville. And the only thing Katie B. ever told me about the whole Newberry lynching was she said her uncle was driving out of Newberry, and George Wynne, who was dying, was laying in the back seat. And when he knew they were trying to go to the train in Gainesville, he rose up from his seat and said, "The gates will be closed," because the gates of the University of Florida closed at 10 o'clock at night. So they couldn't, that was the only road. So they went north to Waldo, and he was dead before they made it to the train. So in his absence, the deputy is being sent away, so the sheriff called a posse, an official posse on horseback, and they were very intent on finding Bosie Long and not letting him get away. And he had been wounded himself. Sheriff Wynne, some of his shots had hit him. So the first thing they went around, we have everything I'm telling you, the name of this original book and this original speech was "This Is What We Know," because it's cited in the record. I mean, there's so much we do not know, but this is what we do know. So while the deputies were looking, this was when they had phones in Newberry and they had telegraph, and the word went out. So men in automobiles, they said a score of them, came from Gainesville, who were friends of George Wynne. I believe these were law enforcement deputies. I'm pretty sure I know who they were, a pretty good idea of a couple of them. And they broke away from the official posse, and Bosie Long had been adopted into a family, the Dennis family and McHenry family. Both he and George Wynne were orphans, and it was in a day when being an orphan was a very tough life. And Bosie Long had lived with his cousins, the Dennis cousins, a black family, farming family. And so this rogue bunch of the crowd in automobiles went to the house, and James Dennis, who was his adopted brother and first cousin, who was a black farmer who had a wife and 3 children, they abducted him out of his house, and then they made him get out of the car to open the gate. And absolutely in the full hearing, possibly in the full eyesight of his wife and children, shot him in the back with a shotgun. And when he hit the ground, they got out and went and turned him over and shot him in the face, so much so that he was disfigured, and then they just picked his body up and took it with them. So that was the very first lynching the next morning at 10 o'clock. And people continued to pour in. They went to Dudley, to the Dudley farmhouse, because we have first-hand oral history, that the Dudley daughters would sneak up the stairs and look at the window to the gathering mob, and then their father would make them go back downstairs. But while they arrested Jim Dennis, while they murdered Jim Dennis, they also took into custody, when his brother went to town to buy his coffin, they arrested him. They arrested his wife and his sister-in-law and her sister, and one of the women was pregnant. One had a nursing infant, 9-month-old infant. And they kept them, maybe they kept them at Dudley. They claim later they kept them at the Newberry jail, but they were brutalized. They kept them for 14 hours. And they said they arrested them because they aided in Bosey's escape, but that was after the fact. So they kept them, brutalized them. One of the women, Maria Dennis, never appears on the record again. Frank Dudley said they just beat her and let her go because she had a baby. But the baby survived and went on to work at the John Deere. Everybody knew him, Mr. Murray Randolph. He was an excellent mechanic, black man. He did talk about it on the public record, but he didn't like to talk about it. But he survived, but Maria Dennis, she might have changed her name, so I don't know. But in any case, these women were kept in the Newberry jail. The men, one of them was, another man arrested was Reverend Josh Baskins, and he was a Methodist preacher in Jonesville, and he was older than the other ones. He was pulled off his wagon. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, at exactly the, Sheriff Wynne had been shot at 2 a.m. in the morning, and 24 hours later, they took him down to, even when I moved to Newberry, it was called Lynch Hammock. If you drive into Newberry, there was a phosphate company over here, and there was a pit, and then there was a beautiful live oak grove where they used to have picnics. And they took him to that picnic ground, and they hung him. A crowd of 200 of the best men, that's who they said, the best men in the county. So they took them and put the men on horses. And this was a family. These were sisters, sister-in-laws, and the men who were hung were their brothers. So the women had to watch their brothers get hung, and then they were hung. And then they set guards by the bodies so that no one would cut them down because they wanted them to be there right on the Newberry Road. They wanted it to become a spectacle lynching. And one of the side notes is that some high school students from Newberry saw the commotion, knew about it, and they followed the mob to the where the lynching, and when they were detected, they made them touch the rope to be implicated. And they took an oath of silence, so they couldn't say, it was an oath of silence. If you told, you had proved you were there. We know the man who did the lynching, his name was Robert Wells. He later was a sheriff of Alachua County. He'd been a deputy. And he did the lynching. They left the bodies there the next morning, and the man who went on the record to talk about it was the man I showed you at the beginning, it's Mr. Berry, Doc Berry. He was later on the school board of Alachua County. I knew him when he was a really, really old man, and he was very, anyway. So he said that when they got up and they saw the bodies there, they let them hang there because it was meant to be a deterrent, because Bosey Long was still on the run. So 1,000 or more tourists drove from all over to drive and see the bodies hanging. And a friend, someone I know who didn't want to be named in it, but he's a direct descendant of the Dudleys and the Jones family, he said his great aunt was one of the children there, as were some of the ladies I lived around in Newberry. And they said that it was such an all-day thing, they didn't cut the bodies down until the afternoon, that the children would push the bodies back and forth like swings, And so that was left in Newberry. Finally, they cut the bodies down, and they allowed the families to come and pick up the bodies at some great risk to themselves, but they came and collected the bodies of their family that had been killed. And then that night, what happened to Bosey Long is when he was wounded, he ran, and in the newspaper they said he ran to a man that happened to have the same last name as him, but wasn't related. Actually, this man was his uncle, but they didn't want to be connected. If you were connected to Bosey Long, that particular mob was still threatening to keep killing family and killing people until Bosey Long turned himself in. So he went to his uncle's house and hid in his field, and then he at dark went and knocked on the door, and his uncle, according to black oral history and people who are direct descendants who have come forward, that his uncle, whose name was Squire Long, told him, they're going to kill the rest of your family. They're going to kill your children. That, if you don't turn yourself in. So they say that when he found out his wife had been murdered, he was so broken that he said, it doesn't matter what they do to me. So Squire Long took Bosie Long into Sheriff Ramsey's house and turned him in. Sheriff Ramsey had many people. Gainesville had been, a solidly Confederate Southern town. It had been garrisoned in the Civil War by Northern troops, but at this point, Gainesville had a lot of Northern businessmen come in, and they wanted progress in 1916. They didn't want their workers being terrified, for one thing. That was a huge thing. So Sheriff Ramsey did a deal. And somehow in the newspaper, it said that Bosie Long had gone to this elderly, it wasn't elderly, he was not that old, but in the newspaper, they made it out like, this elderly black man had saved everybody by turning in Bosie Long. So Newberry was still tender. I mean, it was still just about, they had to take him to the Jacksonville jail. And when he got, and it was all secret. It wasn't even in the paper till years later that's where they held him, in the Jacksonville jail. But when he went to the Jacksonville jail in Newberry, things calmed down, and all of a sudden, everything was secret. Nobody would speak of it. And I know people who are direct descendants of the members of the mob who pick them out, say, yeah, and they are intelligent, educated people. They never heard a word about it. When it happened, Newberry, the decline, it was right on the brink of World War I, so a lot population left because publicly lynching women was even extreme by Florida standards. So it caused but the way that they stopped Newberry from being burned, as Rosewood would be a few years later, was they made a special court session in Gainesville, and they had a trial, and Bosie Long took the stand. This was in October. Bosie Long took the stand, told his side of the story. The other people in a white jury went out and for 7 minutes deliberated, and then they found him guilty, and he was hung in Gainesville. If you've ever gone to Gainesville, you know where the steps of the Hippodrome are. The public hanging, there's a Hyatt Hotel being built there right now, right there to the side. That's where the public hanging, that's where Bosie Long was hung. And in his case, it was 2,000 people came and crowded and stood on the steps and everything and hooted and hollered and laughed, and they were happy, and they used to grease the rope, so it wasn't a clean break. You'd take 10 or 12 minutes to die. So that's happened in Gainesville, and as far as Newberry was concerned, it became this very, very, very secret thing until when I started nosing around, when I was looking around at all of the lynchings. Oh, and here, the lynching photo, here it is again. And the reason I want to say, this was not the night that they hung the people in Lynch Hammock. I believe, I don't know for sure, and as a matter of fact, the photograph, I believe, was George Wynne was from, his family was from Quitman, Georgia, and that's where they took him to bury him. And the train was an hour away, and I believe the reason all of these gentlemen were dressed up, they had gone to his funeral, and then they came back, and they just cut down the bodies, and they're posing around the bodies. And there are merchants. This is Sheriff Ramsey. And these are some of the high school, I assume the high school students. I know several of them. The people in the background, they're phosphate supervisors, they're merchants, the Dudley brothers, who were very young. And the gentlemen in the derby hats are thought to be in the back, that are hanging back there. They were the deputies, probably, that shot Jim Dennis. They're hanging in the background. So this came out when they were identified, and the gentleman in the back probably didn't want their picture taken because they were identifiable public figures. So this was on the AP. That's Marvin Dunnett had been on the AP Wire, and Newberry had a little newspaper, the Newberry Miner, and even though and I do know that it bothers me to show the corpses of people who haven't given me permission, but I think that this is such a vivid picture of Florida's history that I don't want to whitewash it. But you can see one of the, if you look carefully there with their hands tied up, you can see one of the women, Mary Dennis or Stella Young, and they're the men, and this in the background is Josh Baskins. So I dug more into the what exactly had happened, because it was such a incredible secret in Newberry. But when I started looking around, when the mob shop was identified at Dudley, was not living here, but I still love Dudley. If you've ever been there, it's a beautifully replicated farm. But then rumor had come out that I had been part of that it had been a big, PR thing. It was not talked about anywhere. They just kept it secret, but it was a big thing, I guess, in the Park Service. And I had a crazy bunch of them at Plow Day recognize me and corner me like it was going to be a showdown, which I'm a Florida cracker. I didn't mind having a fight if that's what it would have taken, but it didn't. But they had this particular showdown, and I felt badly because there was so much, they were saying they were going to close Dudley now, and they were saying such. And I one day was there with my grandson on Memorial Day, and I was walking around thinking about how much I still love Dudley, and it was just empty that day. Nobody was there. And when I was leaving to go to Newberry, I had to turn, and I was really thinking about it. He was in a car seat, my grandson, and I was thinking, man, I have just got like this white savior complex, and it is stirring the pot, and it's not doing any good. And I looked and was praying, and that is what the sign said, remember. And that is what I wrote in the book, is sometimes you pray for a sign and you don't get one, and sometimes you're not praying for one and you get one anyway. So that's what I did. I did remember. And to me, I love the South, but I don't want the incomplete South. Anybody that grew up in Florida and denies that it was a murderous, for one thing, but it was also just so unjust and so unfair, even in the retelling of the history. So the names of the people who were lynched were so long lost that you had to dig them out of the records. So I'm going to take a minute to say the names. This is James Dennis's grave. They're buried at Pleasant Plain, which is about a mile from Dudley, also about a mile and a half from my house. And on James Dennis's tombstone, I have it in the book, I won't look it up, but a beautiful inscription about him and their love for him. And for his family to put a tombstone up in 1916 was so dangerous, but they did. And this is Josh Baskins. He was the Reverend Josh Baskins. His congregation didn't know he'd been lynched that day on the Saturday, and they came together for a service on Sunday because they didn't know that it was a country church, and somebody had to come in and tell them that he had been killed and hung. And he also has a beautiful inscription from his family. And I love, if you're looking for, because there are, both at Rosewood and Marianna and in Newberry, there were people. In Marianna, there was a man that was a public figure that got up in the back of a flatbed truck before the mob where he was about to be killed. He was a white man, and said, "Do not do this thing. Their blood will be on your hands. Do not do this thing. It's barbaric." And they just, ignored him. Well, this lady, Miss Julia Dennis, I've met her grandson now, but she was the wife of James Dennis, her husband was killed in front of their children. And she went on to raise in the further census all of the orphans of the family who had been killed. She raised them in Newberry and continued to live there till she died. She lived in that community and faced everybody down, and when she died, in I believe it's in '69, her children put her picture on her gravestone. And she is the lady that her grandson told me that in the Gainesville Sun, they said James Dennis was shot resisting arrest. That was the reason the deputy shot him, because he did something. But she was there, and he was shot in the back, that she swore she would never read another newspaper, and she never did till she died, because she didn't trust newspapers. So that's Miss Julia Dennis. So that's how I remember him. Also buried at Pleasant Plain, but I don't have pictures because they don't have tombstones, are Stella Young, Mary Dennis, Maria Dennis. And all of these families were black farmers, and the accusations against them later that they were a ring of thieves, they were hog thieves. Well, I've gone through all of the Newberry court records. We've done everything, and if it was never on the record. And believe me, they believed in arresting people in Newberry. They believed in arresting people in Alachua County, because they were always needing convicts for the mines, to send them to the mines. So I discount it. And the family has always denied it. They would not speak in public. Miss Julia had a granddaughter who was elderly lady, who was going to do an oral history, had been talked by these young activists into giving her history, because she was there when her father was killed. But she was an elderly lady who went into Newberry to a senior luncheon, and when she went to the luncheon, she started shaking, and she was saying, no, nothing happened. I don't want to talk about it. She was just too intimidated. It was the traumatic. And I have also met another elderly man who came to a meeting, and he was the most delightful. He passed this year, the most delightful man, and would talk fishing. He was 87 years old, Wyatt Dennis, and James Dennis was his father. And when someone would ask him, he immediately shut down and would not talk. I mean, it was so traumatic to everyone in Newberry that it was not. But in the meanwhile, I was in Newberry, and it happened that our mayor, as of about 5 years ago, was a local farmer's son who's a history teacher at the high school. And there was people murmuring, and people that wouldn't talk to me in public anymore because I was talking about it and researching it. And he and I happened to sit on the edge of the porch, and I said, well, you know, Jordan, Mayor, that's where Deputy lived. That's the boarding house. That's where, and he had no idea, because his family had been involved, but he was part of the secret generation. In his whole life, he walked in on one conversation, and it was shut down, so he didn't know. So he was blessedly open to reconciliation, and he met with the black community in Newberry. Jonesville is a different community, but they're adjoined, and we our first name was Concerned Citizens. Now we're Truth and Reconciliation, and this is my book at first was just a speech. I wasn't going to come out with a book because I'd never written history before. I was really unsure I could cite it, so that's what a friend of mine, and I had great friends who supported me, including Mike Denham, that were great about it, because I was, help me get it right. So I published it, and when the book came out, I must say that now the state of Florida is moving Becky Perkins, who is the midwife of both Deputy Wynne and Bosie Long, the tenant house that she built, her and her husband built in 1896, has been sitting there. It's been a guest house of a neighboring property owner. When they read the book, when they heard what we were doing in Newberry in Truth and Reconciliation, they donated the house to Dudley Farm, and then we've had a donor who's paid to have it moved there. So Tricia Hilliard-Nunn, Dr. Tricia Hilliard-Nunn, had been doing oral history. She was a incredible woman. She passed 2 years ago. she was doing the oral histories of Black Alachua County, and she and I were going to collaborate, and then she sadly died of cancer. But she told me one time, one of the last times we talked, she said, you know, Janice, you could do like a drive-by book and just point fingers at the state and Dudley and say, you know, they did this, they failed us, blah. Or you can become a volunteer. You can go in collections. You can educate. You can be part of the solution. And I was thinking, well, I will. So Wendell and I became volunteers at Dudley. And this time, when I went in, they gave me the codes to all the collections rooms, the codes to everything. They were incredible. They've been incredibly helpful to me. I mean, they may talk about me behind my back, I'm sure on some level. They hate me, but, you know, they haven't told me that to my face. But I get to go and look at the first source. And when I published this book, the way my agent published it was in 2 years, which is never happens anymore, but all of the rights returned to me because I was so insecure that I was gonna, and I have found out so much stuff since then from working in collections at Dudley that, so I don't know that I'll rewrite it, but it will be mine again. And with the proceeds of this, and also a young man, actor at UF, wrote a play with the Equal Justice Initiative. We became, because of the manuscript, which I donated to the Equal Justice Initiative to read, we were the first town, Newberry, which had such a reputation for racism that even some of the black historians, researchers who are my age, 60, they knew you never went to Newberry if you were black, if you could help it, and you never went at night. It was like Levy County, it was like Cedar Key. It was the word isn't exactly applicable to sundown town because that's a different thing, but that's what it was. You didn't go there. But now Newberry was the first town in Florida to get the Equal Justice Initiative soil collection and have it take, you know, it's in the permanent museum, and we've had ceremonies. And we've had, because of the play, they paid us. They donated back to us the proceeds. So our group, at first it was very awkward getting together because, you know, we were both sides of a horrible thing that happened and everybody was, but now we've become very close enough to bicker with each other. We're kind of like a church group. And we are going, we've had a donor, actually the county, Alachua County, is paying for us to go to the museum when COVID's burn out, whenever that does happen, that we're going to go to the museum in Montgomery, and they're renting us a bus. We're not going to have to take a church bus. We're going to go on a real charter bus, so, and we're getting T-shirts. So we are affecting a really change. The reason I wanted to concentrate on this book tonight, because I have a million stories. You know, I knew Harry Cruz. Pat Conroy's my best friend. I have lots. I know so many writers in Florida as anybody that talks to me. I got the stories. But I wanted to tell this story because it's a Florida story. And that's my story. Do you have questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Janice, for telling that story. We really appreciate it. What a difficult process that whole thing is, and how whole that whole process is. And I really appreciate, you know, you coming. And are there questions? Are there questions or comments? Okay.
As you were talking, it reminded me of the story of the Groveland lynchings.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Dr. Dunn worked on the Groveland 4, and he actually interviewed Sheriff McCall. You know, it's interesting, too, because he had a different take. In Rosewood, there are a lot of emerging angles, you know, that if you read these stories and you read the brief, you know, whatever you've read, now there are a lot more human stories coming up of people, well, the reason they did this is they were related. And so it's the Groveland 4. We drove through Groveland today, and I was thinking about that. I remember, I read the book by Gilbert
Well,
King.
we've had Gilbert here, and of course, that was a 1940s, late 1940s incident, and it just shows that, you know, even as late as that is the 1940s and 50s, this awful legacy was still alive in Florida. And the sad fact is that per capita, Florida had the largest number of lynchings of any other southern state per capita. So again, I really appreciate you sharing this with us, particularly obviously the reconciliation part of it, and how communities can discover these ugly events, and we can only hope that something good would come out of it, because it is very, very difficult to face. I'm sure there's some other comments or questions. Anybody? Okay. Anybody like to have a comment or question on this?
Well, we have found also that the more we talk about this, at first it was so painful, and there was, attacks, and it was, I don't know, it was intimidating. But the more we talk about it and get together, and people understand that we're not putting this shame and, pointing at something because I tell them about my own family history. Now we have people who are joining us, and, the thing that people love, native Floridians love, is history. So
Yes.
So now we gather goodwill and steam, and we're having fun.
Right. Well, tell us a good Pat Conroy story.
Oh, yeah, so many. Yeah, he was my buddy. Actually, I met him through Doug Marlette, the political cartoonist who had a book come out the same year as my book came out in 2002, and I met him on the road, and Pat was his famous friend, but Pat had become such a recluse, and he hated other writers, so he was holed up in Fripp. But Doug and I kept sending out so many emails that Pat started, and I grew up, hearing about Pat, knowing him. He's the huge icon that hangs over Southern writing. And so my brother was a huge Pat Conroy fan. And one day, Pat, he couldn't type, so he called, when we became friends, he called me every day, sometimes called me 2 times a day, and we talked forever, and then, we became great friends. But at the time, he didn't send out, so he sent me this one-word reply, and it was Pat Conroy, and it happened to be a Sunday, and I went to church, and I was bragging to everybody. Pat Conroy wrote me, I met Pat Conroy, he's real, I've got an email. And my brothers are real big pranksters, they're always doing practical jokes. And after about an hour in church, I started thinking, that was a practical joke. My brother Jeff, I've told everybody that Pat Conroy sent me an email, and he didn't, but it turned out it was Pat Conroy. And Doug got killed in a car wreck, and he was going to speak about, he had written the play, the musical Kudzu, and he flew into Memphis, and in a storm, the teacher who was putting on the play was driving him down to Oxford, and they got in this freak accident, and he got killed. So Pat and I he had 1 million eulogists, but we were 2 of his eulogists. And we also just became, me and Pat, everybody that reads him knows that they feel like he was their brother, but he really was I've never met anybody more in every eccentric way. And when he passed, he left his literary executors, or me and his wife, and that's been an adventure. It's been an adventure. And yes, sir.
Is your family reflected at all in the Catts or the White family in American Ghost or My Brother Michael?
Well, usually the rule of thumb is when you write a book that cuts too close, they'll say, oh, I know who that was. That was somebody else, Well, you were clearly writing that about my brother's in-laws or something. And people don't feel it. My father was really close to, he was in his last, Mama had passed, and I would have loved to have heard her opinion, because it would have been hilarious, I can tell you that. But my father was at the very end stages, so he knew what I was writing, but he didn't know, had never read it. But I had a great silence. That is what you do in our family, because they think I'm just crazy anyway. You know, they think I'm so eccentric. For going to the University of Florida, for not going to Bible school was the thing that sent me down the road to crazy. But so they just don't talk about it because they don't want to argue with me. But there was a silence, but they come around, you know, and I don't back down. So they have warmed up. At first, it's just such a silence about this thing that it's. There's a young woman that works at the city of Newberry that I've known her grandmother, known them forever, but spoke at her book clubs, and her grandmother was the preacher, knew a lot of the stuff, but wouldn't ever talk to me on the record. And the reason she didn't is because her granddaughter works at the city of Newberry, and she was afraid she'd lose her job. She wasn't a permanent employee then. And we think of these things as, well, it was 100 years ago. Well, it was all this, but it still affects us, you know. It still affects us.
Okay. I was about to say this is about the quietest you guys have ever been.
Are you concerned that this type of history will possibly no longer be referenced in a classroom in Florida in the future?
Yes. One of the reasons that my publisher and agent wanted to hurry this, you know, through to get it out, because there was a curriculum that I vetted. I was one of the readers that two professors at the University of Florida was writing, and Jordan Marlowe had gotten me in contact, and at the University of Florida on introducing the subject, and the professors who were writing it, it was incredible. So we were excited, and then it became difficult for them to publish it. However, they have succeeded, and now they are having invitations to go to Dublin and talk about it, and to go overseas. So it bothers me because the truth of Florida's history, you can't talk about Dudley history. It's the reason a lot of people like me, native Floridians, white people, go there and think, well, you know, it's beautiful, but it's not really me. You know, this isn't like it should be. And it's because it's missing this huge faction. We're hoping at Dudley to do one of the projects I'm working on, because of Captain Dudley being a slave trader. A lot of enslaved workers came through, and they come to these brick walls, and they're doing DNA and doing family genealogy, and we're trying to connect everybody's, and we are, and we're having success. So yeah, I'm afraid it won't be taught. When I heard that there was, you know, being signed away, I thought it was The Onion. I thought it was somebody had sent me that just to irritate me, you know, that it was a possibility. It was not going to be taught. But maybe I'm being optimistic, but I believe if I'm talking to the most racist person that talks, you know, and if I sit down and say, that wasn't the way it was, you know, if people, like, you know, really talk and say, then they are very open. It's just they have like I don't know, it's being used politically. I left out speaking tonight because my husband was afraid I was going to talk for 3 hours, that when Sidney Katz was running for governor in 1916, he was all over stirring up this, you know, when he ran for governor. And he was even in Ocala the night before. And if I could find documentation, I mean, he had spoken in Newberry 3 weeks before. He spoke afterwards, and it was the same thing. He couldn't win the Democratic, you know, against not, so he's from Alabama. He had killed a black man, you know, in his youth, and he went far, played the extreme racist card, and he won one term of governor. So it's anything.
Well, Janice, that's exactly right. I mean, that's the context.
Oh, there you are.
That's the context of this event.
Yes.
1916, Florida was about to blow sky high with all The Klan was out. The World War I was about to happen. People were frightened. Politicians, well, we know politicians never take advantage of these kind of conditions, do they? They never do that, right? Well, yeah, right. So yeah, there were probably, you know, just on the surface, there were probably numerous things that were taking place in town that we don't know what they were,
Yes.
but this was something that sparked it.
Yes. It was the chapter when I come and introduce, because people in the larger that didn't know the Newberry and Jonesville community thought that Bosie Long and Sheriff Wynne were strangers. You know, the families of Lem Harris said it was a escaping inmate, and I was like, no, they grew up across the street from each other. They knew each other. And later I found where Bosie Long, who told a journalist, I don't know why, you know, said I'd never had any trouble with him before. He lived across the street. So if we could break these stories down to the human, then people say, oh, yeah, that happened to me. Yeah, that happened in my neighborhood. And so, yeah, Florida history and all, and everything's going to be around as long as Janice Owens is around, I can tell you that.
Are husbands
my
allowed to ask questions?
So one of the things that Jan didn't mention is they had the Equal Justice Initiative came to Newberry, and they spent a day there having a ceremony. And part of this ceremony is they collect dirt at the site of the lynching, and they put this soil, and I mean, you know, this is over 100 years later, of course. They put this soil in jars, and then they have the names of all these victims, and then that's what's in the monument up in Montgomery is this soil. And they also have these collections of soil in Newberry, which is stays in the community. So it's in two places. So I'm going to ask Jan a question because I know a lot of those folks in Newberry, and sometimes they don't realize who they're talking to. And one of them told me, he said, yeah, did you hear about those people over there worshiping dirt? Now this I'm talking like a year ago they were saying this. Worshiping dirt is how they describe this. So, Jan, my question to you is, what do you say when these white folks, which I'm one, you're one, what do you say to them whenever they say you should leave that stuff buried, you're just stirring up problems, you're bringing up stuff that doesn't need to be brought up because it's just going to cause racial issues?
Well, the person, I know who you're talking about, and actually I just see her in Publix and still talk to her. I mean, when she brings it up to me, I'll address it, but I spent so many years of my life like bumping, you know, just with people who have very different opinions that, and this is because of the advice of activists who've worked in this a lot longer than I, which is you can score points and stuff, but you don't really have them re-examine and make choices. And the friend you're talking about, that there in Newberry had become when we were out of state, had become, I'm not putting down any political party. This had become the most extreme outside, and it was having a huge influence, and that was one of the very contemptuous of, I don't, you know, of anything we do, but it doesn't matter. We want to do it, and we want to have people be part of our solution. And if we tell history and we welcome them in and we say, oh, you know, that time your grandfather, he lived here and he was a farmer and he sold, you know, we draw them in the conversation. So I just think there's always going to be people that have in this book, some of the meanest. I don't go into some of the most grievous, mean things because I don't want to perpetuate them, but there's always going to be trolls and people who say things like that, and I'm always nice. Let me tell you, they may say that about my work, but when it comes time for me to bring a pound cake to their thing, they still eat pound cake, you know, and they just, eventually, you know, they kind of soften up, I think.
Okay, I get to ask the last question.
Okay.
Okay. You've come off of a very distinguished career of writing fiction, and obviously I've read enough of your fiction to know that it's kind of based on certain people. You know, I can kind of read between the lines or whatever, but how do you feel, what was the difference in this project? Do you feel like, wow, I wish I'd have been a historian all along now, or wow, I just want to know more, or what was it like to write a nonfiction book after your whole life up to this point of writing fiction?
Well, I tried to not, I really wanted, because my agent found, the publishers in New York wanted me to turn this into a kind of the help, you know, I'd be the middle-aged version of the help, or, you know, that book that was so popular. They wanted me to turn it into a memoir about me, which tonight, actually, I've done more, but I wanted it to be, this is what we know. I wanted it to be on that, to be kick the can down the road. And I was very insecure about writing history because I'm not a historian, you're a historian. But I love history and I read history, and as long as I cited, you know, if you don't believe this, look here, and if you don't believe here, and if you don't think, I'm not lying, you know, I pulled it from the public record, make up your own, you know, call your own shot. But anything was better than the silence, and nobody had written very much. Nobody had done, there's something about these huge violent things that if they're in silence, there's a hold that people have. The people that know, that are in the oath, they have a little inside, yeah, we remember. And when you put it out in a book and a chronological history, it loses its terror. It's no longer a ghost story, it's history. And it's people making horrible decisions, and you think, how did they do it? But there it is, they did.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, our next program will be on March 17th in the Hollis Room, and we look forward to welcoming you there as well. So, Janice, I'm sure would be delighted to sign a book for you, talk a little bit after the program, and we're all set up outside for that. Thank you.